Let's go ahead and get started for today. Welcome back. I hope that you had a good weekend. We are moving right along with the quarter. I know this has been kind of a challenging week with a lot of things needing to be canceled, Omicron, and all that fun stuff. So if you're falling behind and need help, remember you can always join us through Zoom or also catch the recordings after class. So let's go ahead and get started on some of the stuff for this week. I want to start with just a few minutes to help you with brainstorming and planning. This is not going to be something that you need to turn in. We'll do a group activity for attendance in just a little bit. But I do want you to take a little bit of time to touch base in regards to your listening assessment assignment. Remember that this assignment is due on Wednesday. In class, I asked you to have a conversation with somebody else, to engage in active listening, and then to reflect on that process of active listening. So again, you won't be turning this in, but as notes for you to write to yourself or to start to think about, I want you to first take stock on your current progress on that assignment. For instance, do you have a draft, do you have an outline, or maybe it's an assignment you haven't started yet, but you have a plan of knowing what to do. So take some time to reflect on what's completed, work on for this assignment, what you still need to do. And then I encourage you to give yourself a bit of a timeline to think about between now and the end of the day on Wednesday, what you'll need to do to wrap things up. Maybe you're going to finish parts 1 and 2 today, the third part of the assignment by Tuesday, and give it a final go around or revision on Wednesday or something like that. So give yourself a little bit of time to think through what that looks like. And then if you have remaining questions regarding this assignment, including its expectations, its grading, its formatting, or anything else, you can also take a couple minutes to write those down. And I'm happy to talk through and help to answer those questions for you as well. as you're thinking through and brainstorming, I did want to direct you to just what's available again for you on Canvas in regards to this assignment, and also what you should expect going forward in the class based on Canvas availability. So you'll notice, right, the listening assessment is coming up. You'll notice that under week 3, it's listed there. And also, it'll show on the sidebar for you since it's an upcoming due assignment. Again, as a reminder, you're using that in-class conversation that you had with somebody as a way to start out by thinking about your listening skills. You're not graded based on how well you listened or how nitty-gritty details you were able to get out of the conversation. But I am asking you again to first summarize that conversation in your own words. What did you learn? What stood out to you through that process? Secondarily, right, you are thinking about listening as a 5-step process. We've talked about the ways that involve things like attending, recalling, and so on, right? In addition to explaining and defining those steps, right, you want to really make sure you have a clear connection. So I've looked at a couple drafts so far for people that have turned those in. The thing that I'm noticing to really work on, right, is try to avoid step 1 of listening is attending. I did attending by paying attention to the message, right? That's fairly shallow, and that doesn't really get at a whole lot of detail about the communication. One way to do this would be to say the first step of listening involves attending to, right, and picking up on the message. I did this by really trying to focus in on the other person. I tried to eliminate distractions. I went to the corner of a room where nobody was talking, and I really tried to maximize an environment where I could make that person heard, right? So show us how you're doing those different 5 steps and try to provide some examples of how you did that process. So I think using good examples in depth here will help for that section of the assignment. In terms of active listening, again, similarly, you want to define it, but also to explain how you integrated and utilized active listening. So again, for instance, using things like eye contact, using paraphrasing or confirming statements, and so on. By providing examples of those, right, you show us how you're doing those things. Remember, this isn't a major, scary assignment. It's only about 2 pages or so. So just know that's there. Just 10% of your grade or 100 points. Again, the rubric is available for you on the second page. You want to make sure, again, that you're answering and fully addressing each part of the prompt, using an introduction and conclusion that relates to the topic. One thing you don't have to do is to do like a broad, sweeping discussion of communication, right, or of listening. Right? You don't need to say listening is what brings us together. It's an important part of what we do, right? Don't worry about really broad introductions or conclusions. Instead, say, maybe in your introduction, the conversation that I had was focused on this. Here I'll be exploring the conversation, the steps of listening I used, and active listening, right? And then remember that you do want to use citations. I recommend EPA. You can use MLA or Chicago if you really want to. The textbook full citation, again, is available on Canvas for you to use. As a reminder, right, if you're directly quoting, make sure you're including the page number. I recommend looking back through your notes or looking back through the text on pages related to the listening process and on active listening so that you can refer back to those exact page numbers as you're working through the project. So again, rubric's there. It's due on Wednesday. So at this point, I wanted to see, does anybody have any questions related to this assignment expectations, or anything else in order to prepare for submitting this? Okay. I'd imagine that as you're drafting and working through things, questions might come up between now and the end of the day on Wednesday. So if they do, feel free to email me. Again, I also have my office hours. You can get in touch with me. I'll be upstairs right after class or available through Zoom. So that's available for you too as you're working through this. Remember that the late policy for the course is if it's unexcused, right? It's 5% for each day the assignment is late. So in 90% becomes an 85%, and so on. there's an emergency or an event that does prevent you from completing it on time, let me know. And then remember that you were given a get out of jail free card. You can use it once over the course of the quarter. If you choose to use it for this assignment, right, you can turn it in up to a week late with no penalty. You could also choose to save that for a later assignment. Remember that the get out of jail free card is use it or lose it. So if you make it through without using it in the quarter, it doesn't give you extra credit or anything like that, but it is an option to help you out if you're running behind. If you still want to turn in an outline or draft, please get that in to me by the end of the day today so that I can turn that around for you. Again, I've looked at a couple, and it helps people's grades out a lot if they do that. Then we went through the rubric and guidelines to help you as you're working through this. All right, so with that in mind, by the way, if you do have a question about this assignment that you realize comes up later, feel free to stop me. Last class, we talked about the way that we use listening in online mediated spaces, right? So our major idea from last week was that listening is not just something that happens face-to-face, but it's also something that happens through synchronous communication like Zoom, phone calls, FaceTime, and it can happen asynchronously, like using social media platforms such as Twitter and so on, right? We listen, pick up on information in a lot of digital settings. We had to do that a lot over the past 2 years, and it's been a challenge to figure out how to listen effectively when there are so many more distractions available for us, and there are fewer, as you all mentioned, nonverbal cues that really let us understand and make sense of messages. So we've talked about technology and the way that it shapes our listening, and how we can get better at online listening too. You might recall from last class, we talked about how there's different norms and expectations on different platforms, again, including the way that things such as Twitter, right, will create different guidelines on who you can be friends with, how you can use social media, and so on, right? And media shapes the way that we listen online in many ways by filtering. At times, it can risk becoming an echo chamber, right? If the only perspectives we're hearing are the ones that confirm our own beliefs and ideas. However, we also know that media can be a force for creating connections. One of the biggest challenges, right, of listening and participating online is that it can kind of feel like you're speaking into the void, right? You post something on media or you share something online, and it can be difficult to feel like there are actually people that are listening, or that you know who the people are that are listening, right? For instance, on social media, if you see an advertisement for your favorite brand of ice cream, and you start posting a comment that says, I really like your ice cream, I wish you would do a salted caramel flavor. And then the company says, oh, thanks for sharing, we're listening to your feedback, right? You don't know who that customer service person is that's running the handle. You don't know that they're actually listening. It could just be a generic thing that they say. So a challenge is to really feel like somebody is listening and taking your perspective into consideration, especially when it comes to more like a business context, a political context, right, where members of Congress are going to send out generic replies and it doesn't seem like they're really listening to them. So that can be a real big challenge, right, is to feel like listening is hard to confirm online in a way that it isn't face-to-face or through using verbal feedback such as in a Zoom call, right? So the difficulty of being there and of quantifying and figuring out if somebody else is listening is a thing we talked a little bit about last week. So for this class, we're going to make a transition from thinking about listening in media and online, although it definitely implicates this entire process, into thinking about listening in more of a professional sense, right? So we're kind of applying listening to a lot of different areas, including professional settings, including issues of culture, of race, of identity, gender, and so on, right? So this is one of the applications and areas to think about where listening is important and is useful, right? Not to say that listening is only useful because it helps with work and professional life, but because it is a skill that we can use and apply in a lot of different areas. We'll be talking about what listening means in these types of situations. We'll discuss some of the ways listening is valuable professionally and also some of the challenges. You've likely noticed that for this week, there are 2 articles available. And these 2 articles get at listening in professional contexts in two different ways. So the first reading, the listening in a business context, is going to be the one we'll be exploring a bit for today and asking you to potentially look back through for the group activity we'll be doing in a bit. And then the other reading is about listening in a diverse workforce. And it's structured a little bit more loosely as a dialogue between two scholars who are talking about the listening process. So I wanted to include two shorter articles to give you two different perspectives on what it means to listen in a lot of these kind of applied and professional fields. So kind of like as a guiding or maybe overarching question, you might ask yourself what it means to listen professionally, right? So speaking super broadly about what professional listening might be or what it looks like, what comes to mind when that question comes up? What does it mean to listen professionally? Eye contact? Yes. So eye contact, showing non-verbally that you care and you're listening to somebody's message. Definitely an important component. What else?
You're engaged in the conversation.
Yeah, so engagement, being active. So these are some good kind of major ideas about listening. In terms of like a professional or applied context, what might be some of the expectations or ways that you're asked to listen that are different than just talking to a friend? Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes proximity will determine like your relationship to them.
Yeah. Right. So proximity, including like physical proximity, right, definitely plays a really big role. You know, so like you randomly run into me at the grocery store, right? That can be an issue of proximity perhaps as well. So one challenge, right, is that we oftentimes have to regularly interact with people at work and in professional situations, whether we like to or not, right? We get coworkers and people that we work with that we don't always enjoy or wouldn't choose to spend our time with. But because there's this regular proximity and interaction we do have to develop norms for listening, respecting, and so on, right? Oftentimes with friends, we get to choose a lot of those relationships that we spend our time. We get to choose to listen, and we're a lot more motivated to listen if we really care, right? But if you have a chatty coworker that keeps talking about their day all the time and venting at you, that can be a harder boundary to draw because you know you have to see them on a regular basis. So that's something to think about, right? Is the way that professional communication forces us to interact with people and listen, even if we don't always want to. So when it comes to professional communication and what it means to listen professionally, I think there's three different ways that we can go about thinking through this process. And again, I think it gets to a lot of the points you all raised in answer to that question. To listen professionally, think about it as I'm a professional listener, right? Or I'm good at listening professionally. It means developing skills, right? And honing what it means to listen in a lot of those professional and applied situations. One thing that you'll see that the reading talks about for this week and we'll be getting at is that a lot of people that are in leadership roles, such as a team captain, such as a supervisor, a boss, right, are people that are in positions where they really do need to listen. And that's a skill that they have to develop over time. Because if you're a supervisor, right, and your workers are overstretched and not feeling supported, that's an important thing to listen to and to correct and to deal with in order to make a more positive environment for everybody, right? So developing those kinds of skills to figure out how to listen and to pay attention and to track messages can really help you. So to listen professionally means to develop listening as a skill. Secondarily, right, to listen professionally, if we think about what professionalism means, right, that term I think has a lot of problems. What we define as professionalism looks really different for folks of a variety of different identities and backgrounds, right? For example, there has been really problematic and racist history of people of color being sort of told that they can't wear hair in a certain way that thankfully has been corrected in a lot of professional applications, right? So what we define as professionalism can be a problem, but it also means that we can show if we think about professionalism more in respect and engagement with others in a positive way, right, that we can show that level of respect and support. You're at a meeting, right, and you know that you need to work through a difficult challenge or issue. You're not going to be on your phone the whole time or rolling your eyes or responding in a disrespectful way, right? So, for instance, in something like the US Senate, there was a case where there was a senator who was like rolling his eyes and making like nonverbal expressions while the other was speaking and got formally reprimanded because that wasn't considered to be acceptable or appropriate nonverbal communication, right? That's an important consideration too. And then lastly, right, to listen professionally means to use the skills of listening in a professional setting. That is, that where you work, whether it's face-to-face or digital, right, or your group chat, is a setting where you have to regularly use listening behaviors to understand and work with others. Again, pretty straightforward, but I think some of these applications are useful ways for us to look into listening in a bit more detail. So another key idea here, right, is that while listening is super valuable and really helps us to grow, it's not something that we really see talked about a lot or valued professionally in the same way, right? If you started a new job or you've joined a team, right, or you've joined an extracurricular event, there's a really good chance that you are not going to hear a lot about listening or about how you should listen. And there's a lot of reasons that we don't think about listening in a super important way. One of them, as we've talked about before, is that it's very difficult to measure listening. It's not like you have a scale of 1 to 100 and you say, oh, well, we're listening at an 80 and we need to move up to an 85, right? That's not something that you can really measure because listening comes down to a lot of nonverbal cues. It comes down to feedback and participation in a way that can be really messy. Oftentimes, right, a lot of companies will look at things like profits. We'll look at things such as day-to-day, week-to-week improvements that can have a tangible change. Listening is a lot harder to do. Another issue is that listening can't be easily put into cause-effect relationships, right? By cause-effect, right, it means you flip the switch and the light turns off. The same way, it's hard to say, because we listened to this person, they were able to stay on the job. So in situations like that, listening is difficult to directly connect to an outcome. Because listening can help you better understand or relate to or really engage with an experience, yes, it can definitely have a good and tangible impact. But again, it's hard to trace. And then listening, again, is something that we don't necessarily value or put a lot of effort into. A lot of the discussion we've seen, right, has been about production, right, creating content, creating, writing, material, resources for others. A lot of work and application is focused on what you do or what you bring. There's actually a study that's referenced in this piece that says that we spend about 80% of our lives communicating, right? And that of that 80%, if you think about it, right, it's talking to somebody, texting somebody, communicating at work, right? A lot of that communication does come down to listening. In fact, about 45% of the communication we do is listening, whereas maybe 35 to 40 is talking. So it's something we do a lot, but it's not something we talk about a lot. So this piece, one of the two articles, and again, the one that we're going to be looking into a little bit more for today, is from Dan Flynn, and it's called Listening in the Business Context. So Flynn, the first author on this piece, is an associate professor in Georgia who is really actively involved in understanding listening and some of the ways that listening is applied and being used. So again, this article, right, as I mentioned before, some of the academic or like scholarly styles of articles can sometimes be a little bit weird, complicated to read. This article really is giving you an overview of how listening has been studied and examined, right? It says there's been this work, it says listening can do these things. But there's also a lot that listening still needs to be accounted for. So this piece is suggesting that we understand the value and importance of listening, but there's more we need to do to understand how listening works and why listening matters. So one of the key ideas here that comes out over the course of this review and understanding of listening is what's known as a managerial paradox. So if you think about it, right, if you've ever taken on the role of being a boss or a team captain or an advisor or somebody that has some level of leadership or mentorship over another person, right? You find yourself in this weird situation where you simultaneously are trying to listen to somebody else. You want to understand them and engage with them. But at the end of the day, because of the power that you have over that person or the role that you have, right, you do have to judge and you do have to evaluate that person, right? For instance, if you're a coach and you're a coach for like a middle school team, say like a middle school soccer team, right? And you've got a middle schooler who comes up and says, you know, my arm is sore, I'm not feeling very good, I'm having a hard time, right? You would simultaneously want to support and listen to them, recognize you're having a rough time, but you are kind of coaching and judging them. You say, maybe, you know, you can take some time off and come back later. So it can feel weird because if you're a boss or you're somebody that has some level of power, you do want to understand the person, while at the same time you have to make some type of judgment or evaluation, right? One thing that's common, including folks that might have been working a job for a while, right, is the idea of a performance review, where regularly you go in and you're evaluated on the work that you've been doing. Oftentimes that's conversational. You share, okay, I've been doing well so far, these are the things to improve on and so on, right? And your supervisor is going to listen, but the supervisor also has to draw the line and say, yes, you need to work on this and this. So it can be hard to feel like you're listening very well if you are judging, evaluating other people, right? Critical listening can be useful, but critical listening might not be comprehensive in the way that things like active listening might be, as we talked about. And then another key idea here is the idea of organizational listening. That is the physical or digital location, the space itself, the group or company or organization that you're a part of, right, is itself an environment that shapes the image of the group, the way that the group communicates, the way the group listens. We talked about that a little bit last week when we talked about things such as common spaces, right? Things such as lounges or conference rooms, or maybe things such as a group chat, right? Using channels like Tag, Snapchat, Slack, Discord, and so on. That there are spaces where organizations allow people to communicate and to work together. So the environment in which communication and listening happens is an important way for us to think about the sort of way that organizations communicate professionally. So these are a couple core ideas that come out through this process, right? Is listening is this important and underdeveloped skill? We don't really know a whole lot about how listening can impact the process of an organization, but the environment and setting in which listening happens is really important. So what I'm going to be doing is breaking you all off into 3 different groups. And then one of the things that you noticed, if you've taken a look at the article already, or will notice if you pull it up, is that there are 3 major categories discussed in this article about ways that listening happens professionally. One of them being that listening is a work skill. Secondarily, that listening can serve things such as career advancement. And then third, that listening is an organizational characteristic. So the article breaks down these 3 categories as different ways that listening can be applied and used professionally. So I want you, particularly those that have a device available or are able to access the reading for today, to explore and dive into some of those. If you don't have that, then you can check in with people that do and are able to pull the article up, or to think about in your own words, in your own situations, how this category would make sense to you. So what I want us to do, right, is each group will be assigned one of these three. And looking at this application, right? What does this application look like? When is it used? So for instance, when is listening a work skill? How is listening used as a work skill? Secondarily, what does it mean to be good at this form of listening? What are the benefits that it brings to the table? For instance, right? What does it mean as an organizational characteristic to be good at that, to have a good listening organization? And then lastly, what might be an example of utilizing this type of listening? How might somebody use listening for something like career advancement? So again, one person per group can work on writing down or preparing that, and I will ask each group to share. So let's do three groups of five, and then Destiny will have you work on the third category. So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Focus on listening as a work skill. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Derek. We'll focus on listening and career advancement. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Focus on listening as an organizational characteristic. So again, if you have a device, are able to pull up the reading, you can. If you don't, you might think about and brainstorm on your own what this would look like. Work together with your group on this. Yeah, and Destiny, I'm just going to ask you to jot down how you might address listening as an organizational characteristic.
You want to do the flower up. I think it's the business one.
I'm tired. Someone says false or wrong. I was just sitting there like that.
I can say it again.
For art. It's like middle managers treated as a lower priority skill, but as they move up, see it as a higher priority, but they also feel less prepared.
Right, exactly, yeah, it's like. Open communication climate. And
Right, we can do it. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know about that.
So take a bit more time in this, then we'll ask somebody from each group to share.
Yeah.
changes.
There's another quote that said.
Yeah.
Take another minute or two on this. And already wrap up.
So mad at Bill's law.
I know.
We should.
All right. So let's go ahead and chat about this together in just a little bit. I'll ask each group to share the way that they looked at this application. So let's start here with the first group. How did you see the application of listening as a work skill in answer to these questions?
We talked about how listening as a work skill can vary depending on your work. So like if you're like a pre-K teacher, that's maybe like a different kind of work skill than like listening as a fully student.
Sure.
Skill sets, even though they are both forms of professional listening. So talking about the variety in the field of professional listening. And it's used, I think it's a skill that's used constantly.
Sure. And then what about when it's what it means to be good at this form of listening?
If you're talking to someone above you, someone below you, your coworkers, or the discussion customers, you want to make sure that they know that you're listening and you're taking it seriously, especially because I think it's not like a casual conversation.
Yeah.
And then benefits are that it can just help to foster a positive environment with those around you, whether it's like between coworkers or customers especially, and that's all just going to help with business or group flourish in general.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Macy and Nicole. I think you all spoke to the ways that there's a lot of different examples in situations in which being good and being positive at listening is going to look a little bit different, but some shared ways that that is important too. Let's hear from the middle group here about listening and career advancement. What came out in your group's discussion?
So what we found was it was less more like career advancement was a singular applicable skill. It was more a pattern of listening practices themselves. We found that what the article said was that kind of lower middle management generally value listening less, participate in it less. I think it said they are more akin to like report writing, persuasive speech, that kind of thing. Whereas as someone advances, listening skills become a higher priority. They have to do it more often, twice as much as other employees within the student's field. I think it said, I can't remember what the industry was talking about, but it was, it gave less examples of individual types of this listening and more or less just said, as someone's career advances, listening is more valued, even though it's not necessarily fostered in the lower ranks.
Sure. Right. So I think that's a good way to think about it. And it's in the name, right? If you were a manager, right, your goal is to manage or to work with people. So as career advancement or development happens, or you find yourself shifting in the kind of work you do to having a leadership role, right, where you are managing or working on how members of a group operate, listening skills in that way do become really important. And again, that paradox becomes important too. As you balance out listening with at the same time drawing a line and thinking about how judgment or evaluation plays into that as well. So in terms of career advancement, right, if somebody does occupy a position that involves leadership or management, what would it mean to be good at that type of listening? It would be a way of showing listening skills at that level.
Wouldn't it just be able to be like adapting to the changes, like since you're moving up, you're able to adapt with the communication levels and the listening levels?
Yeah, right. So adaptation definitely plays a role, Lily. I also think thinking about how creating designated time or space or environment for listening is an important consideration too. For instance, maybe you're in charge as a team captain and you give people 5 to 10 minutes each day to just vent or share whatever they'd like, right? Another idea that gets brought up in the article is the idea of leading by example, right? Being a good listener at a more supervisor or managerial level means that you're creating an environment in which people more broadly can feel listened to and supported too as well. So showing leadership and listening can definitely impact groups. Lastly, let's hear from listening as an organizational characteristic, which stood out in you all's work as a group.
So what does this application of listening look like? And it's like the CEO or whoever is in charge finds ways to make their employees feel heard and valued. Additionally, an open communication environment that makes communicating and listening easy. And then 2, what does it mean to be good at this form of listening? And this looks like an open environment where infrastructure is designed in a way that facilitates listening and communicating to minimize distractions. And a benefit is that it creates self-worth. What is an example of utilizing this kind of environment? Utilizing this kind of listening to change perception of the company. This could look like redesigning the environment like that the employees work in so that it boosts positive communication and then again minimizes distraction.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. One example, right, that kind of builds off of that is a lot more companies, groups, and startups are using like open floor plans, right, where there aren't the same like designated cubicles or spaces, but instead there's more of a common space. Obviously less so with COVID, right, but there have been a lot of changes in how the physical environment is created with an intent of trying to create more open communication. Destiny, is there anything you'd like to add as far as listening as an organizational characteristic?
I don't think so. I think he pretty much got everything that I wrote down.
Yeah, so I appreciate the examples that all 3 groups brought to the table, right? That listening can be used in professional context in a lot of different ways, right? As a work skill, as Nicole and Macy brought up, right? It means that we are building good understanding, good relationships, and show that we're listening to things like nonverbal cues. In career advancement, right? The middle group brought up the idea that in kind of upper management roles or as careers change, right? There might be a greater need to focus on good listening and to build those skills. And lastly, that as an organizational characteristic, physical or digital environment creates the way that members of a group are able to work together and understand one another. So there are all ways to think about and apply some of the ideas that we've talked about today in a lot of situations. So to wrap up, we talked about listening in terms of professional skills and development. We talked about the ways that it's underestimated, but at the same time, used in a lot of different areas. Again, that gets at a lot of the core of this first reading about understanding what we do and don't know about applied listening. On Wednesday, we're going to be taking a look at the second article and talking about the ways that things such as culture, right, and a diverse culture and world impact the listening process too, and building on some of these ideas. So go ahead and email or pass forward your group's work, again, 1 per group for today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday.